Hi, good afternoon to those of you joining from New York and elsewhere on the East Coast, and good evening or good morning, depending on where else in the world you are. I'm Rob Siemens. I'm director of NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first strategy speaker series event of the year. And my honor to introduce our two speakers, Accenture Research's Francis Hintermann and NYU Stern Vice Dean and Professor JP Eggers. Francis Hintermann is the Global Managing Director of Accenture Research, a team of 300 researchers based in 20 countries around the world. In this role, Francis is responsible for shaping and delivering the thought leadership agenda of Accenture, an IT professional services firm with over 500,000 employees worldwide. Francis, a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris, joined Accenture Paris in 1998 to create the strategy research team. He then developed it across Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific before taking his current role. In parallel, Francis has been supporting financial services clients in various research consulting roles, both in France, in Europe, and at the global level. Francis has been the Sherpa of Accenture's CEO at B20 and G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance summits between 2011 and 2018, representing Accenture at B20, G20 summits in France, Russia, Australia, Turkey, China, Germany, and Argentina. His current area of focus is analyzing strategic and economic impacts of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, on companies' priorities and public policy making. And it's a topic that we're going to dive into in a lot of detail today. In addition to the many other things that Francis does, I'm honored to say that he currently serves on the External Advisory Board for NYU Stern's Center for the Future of Management. So we're very excited to have Francis join us, join us today. JP Eggers is my colleague. He's the Catherine and Peter Kellner Professor of Entrepreneurship and Management in Organizations here at NYU Stern. He is also currently the Vice Dean for MBA and graduate programs and the director of the one-year Tech MBA program. JP received his PhD from the Wharton School. He studies both the behavioral processes of innovation and the evolution of organizations, technologies, and industries. His teaching includes strategy, innovation, and business analytics with a focus on a blend of the three. Before turning the floor over to our speakers, I just have a couple of very brief announcements. First, welcome to all the audience that's here. Please feel free to submit questions for Francis and JP throughout the session using the Zoom Q&A function. We'll start with a discussion between Francis and JP, and then we'll turn to audience questions after that. Second, we would love to welcome you back to future programs and keep you updated on the research that we're generating. So if you're not already on our mailing list and you would like to join, please sign up on our website, which is stern.nyu.edu/CFM. All right, without further ado, let me turn things over to my NYU colleague, JP Eggers.
Thank you, Rob. Really exciting to get a chance to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this conversation today. And most importantly, thank you to Francis for taking the time to chat with us today and talk a little bit about predicting the future and trying to think about where things are headed for all of these interesting topics. Maybe before we get started in too much detail, can you maybe spend a little bit of time tell us about the work that you do at Accenture Research and how this fits into Accenture overall?
Yeah, thank you, JP and Rob, for inviting me today. My pleasure to be with you. At the core of it, Accenture Research is part of the Office of a Chief Strategy Officer of Accenture. The Chief Strategy Officer is currently named Bhaskar Ghosh. He's the one who is really thinking about the next steps of a strategy for Accenture as a corporation. And as you know, Accenture is a corporation of around $50 billion. In terms of employees, we've got more than 600,000 around the world. And hence, there are many questions around next steps in terms of technologies, businesses, geographies that the company should investigate. So we are financed by Accenture. It's an investment of Accenture. And then, of course, on the back of that, we are also sharing some of the insights that we develop with our clients around the world, with our communities, of course, and more generally speaking, all our shareholders, in the sense that Accenture being a a large company has got as an intent to help the communities around us to grow as well, because we know that to be successful we need to live in thriving ecosystems, and the way we distribute our research, our thought leadership is a way as well to support our ecosystems around the world.
So maybe actually just to help kind of frame some of these discussions, actually, I might ask about process for a second. So, I think when people think about trying to do research or think about the future of technology or technology trends, there's anything that ranges from like, maybe specific research-driven ways to do this versus to, prognostication and, guesswork by numbers of people. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you go about these things, and like what is it that makes you confident that anyone is able to do a good job at trying to predict these things?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I would say, first of all, in terms of the positioning of Accenture Research within Accenture and the specific value that we aim to bring is really looking at the business impacts of emerging technology. So we are convinced at Accenture that technologies, generally speaking, grow exponentially. The way that businesses, organizations absorb these technologies is not growing exponentially. So there is a gap in between the evolution of technologies and the way that companies absorb them, and we work on that gap. Part of our job is to help organizations to close that gap, or at least to reduce it as much as possible. And as we are convinced at Accenture that the waves of technology changes are getting stronger and faster along the years, it means that we have to be extremely precise on the way we assess these waves, the way they impact businesses, the way they impact different industries, different functions, and how different function leaders, C-level executives, can actually absorb that into their own organization and create value with it. We are not, as such, a technology organization at Accenture Research. We've got Accenture Labs, which is an organization dedicated to really studying, researching, developing new technologies. We're working on the absorption of technologies by businesses. And so the way that we develop methods and tools to enable that is really to develop a portfolio of techniques. And the ones we work on right now, which to me are the most exciting for the future of business research, is on one end to develop AI at the core of the research as we do. We've been speaking, of course, about data-driven business research for a while. It's happening now. And it's happening not only in terms of big data, it's happening in terms of putting AI at the core of it. When you think about all the data that you can leverage, not only on social media, people speak a lot about social media, but look at all the comments put by employees on job site. Look at all the way that people put their profiles on internet, and then you can see them evolving from one country to another, one type of job to another. There are lots of high frequency data that we can now absorb, model, in order to attempt to show the way that it's going to be for companies going forward. So for me, it's really putting AI at the core of it. That's the first thing. And right now, if you ask me, who are in the team compared to 5 years ago, we've got a lot more data scientists than we used to have. Former consultants, we used to have industry experts. Now at the core of it, we've got data scientists working with the rest of them. So that's one leg. There is a second leg, and the second leg is all about experience, what we call experiential research. Is that we used to have, focus groups in the old days. Now it's really focus group online at scale, at speed, and that is changing a lot. We may speak today about the Metaverse. To me, that's part of what the Metaverse can bring in terms of research, is that we can actually run experiments real time in environment online that we could not use before. And when you combine the insight that you've got for this data-driven insight with the experiential research, then you can, at least we think, we can develop some direction for our company, first of all, and then for our clients as well. When you ask me how confident I am, I'm confident about the way we analyze the way technologies evolve, because we've seen that over the years. As I mentioned, we've seen the waves, we measure the waves, we look at them, and on that I'm confident. And if we have made some mistakes in the past, and of course we've made some, been more by being cautious on the way that technologies were evolving rather than being too optimistic. And so that's where I think we are careful about now that technologies are progressing at a speed which is amazing. But of course, there are issues to look at in terms of the way that companies can absorb these technologies and create value with these technologies. Issues about digital nationalism, to use an understatement. Of course, that can impact the way that companies can absorb that across the world. And last but not least, the inclusion and diversity, which may seem unrelated to that initially, that actually we think is at the core of it, is that at the core of research, we speak about data, but it's talent. It's about people. And the way to develop efficient research team these days, we need to get a diversity that frankly we didn't have even 5 years ago, and that we want to have in the US, in the UK, in South Africa, and in other countries where we've got an emphasis now on making sure that we're bringing that diversity angle from the very beginning of defining the research protocol. And that's something that we didn't have so much in the past, and that we want to have at the core of it, because it's a way as well to enable our research community to thrive in the future.
Cool. So what you're short of it is a little more robust than armchair prognostication, hopefully. So, but no, clearly it is, which is great, and the whole reason to have the conversation. I am going to selfishly go off script for a second here. You talked about this gap between the rate at which technology is changing and evolving and the rate at which companies are able to absorb and kind of give benefit from those technologies. Without going into too much detail, because I do want to move on to some other topics, why does that gap exist from your perspective? Why are companies struggling to absorb these new technologies and take advantage of them? Or at least, what are some examples of ways in which you've seen that happen?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Just on the term prediction, one interesting thing I've seen and in the past few years, at least a lot since COVID, is that scenarios are back. So it's a bit less about prediction. There is only one future. It's a little bit more about let's envision the different futures that may happen. And I used to work on scenarios 20 years ago. To me, there is a revival of a scenario approach now, powered by data, powered by everything we do online, which is bringing some new insights to the way we can look at the future without necessarily being, extremely focused to the point of being stuck on one view of a future. On the point at the core of it, change is hard. That's what it is. When you look at large organization, and as a large company, we work not only but predominantly with large organization. In large organization, you've got legacy processes, you've got legacy IT system, and when you deep dive on legacy IT system, you've got a fair amount of technical debt, and so that means that lots of services which would genuinely like to change are in fact facing obstacles in terms of the legacy systems, the legacy processes, and the fact that lots of people have to be reskilled, upskilled. And interestingly enough, in most of our research on these obstacles, when we speak to C-level executives, so the C-suites, they quite often mention the issue of talent first, that the people do not have the right skills anymore. Actually, when we speak with employees, in most cases, employees are eager to learn. They're eager to learn more. And generally, there is this gap between the C-level executives who are extremely focused around to create value in the short term. Let's focus on the system. Let's focus on the processes. Whereas, in fact, part of the solution is in upskilling, reskilling employees who are a lot more ready to do it than generally assumed. So to me, it's a lot connected to that.
Certainly, I think for me, certainly as someone who's spent a lot of time working with big companies trying to be innovative, this gap and the reasons for its existence and why firms struggle to kind of take advantage of the technology that's out there is, I think, a fascinating and important question. But as we talk about technology evolving and we talk about some of the key trends that are out there, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't start with one of the bigger buzzwords that's out there these days and talk about the metaverse a little bit. The cynic in me feels like whenever we start seeing new terms like this, signs of vaporware just instantly come to mind, and I'm just like, who knows what? I don't even know how to define this, let alone what it's actually going to do. What's the there when we talk about metaverse? What is it, and especially if we think about kind of both short and longer term, what is this going to mean for businesses? Like, what is this going to mean for the way work gets done, or education, or all kinds of things that could be relevant for thinking about here?
Yeah, no. It's a fair point, JP, and we just finished a survey of C-level executives about the metaverse, of course, and what we've seen is that there is a polarization. On one hand, you've got 80% plus of C-level executives who have heard about it, because the buzz has been so big since last fall that really, nearly all of them have heard about it. So they've got questions. Now, if we ask about them a few more technical questions about, what's their understanding of it, what they want to do in it, then we've got a tiny minority. In our survey, it's something like 15% of them who said, I'm familiar enough with it that I know exactly where I want to invest going forward. And so we've got to address that about the metaverse. Your point is, of course, a fair point in terms of being cautious about it. Our position is slightly different in the sense that we understand there are a series of obstacles that we can discuss in terms of technologies, in terms of talents and readiness, in terms of as well what we would call a responsible metaverse, right? And I'm part of a generation who helped to promote internet from the early beginning of this century. There are some aspects of it which we do not want to see in the metaverse, and we are extremely careful about that, and it's part of the way we look at it at Accenture. So there are definitely obstacles, risks that have to be assessed properly. Having said that, we believe that approach, that this series of technology combined in the metaverse, is really going to change the internet, and that we're going to see something happening which is going to be at the scale of what we've seen 20, 25 years ago with the internet, because the possibilities of it, the potential of it is so strong in multiple dimensions that it's going to revolutionize enterprise at the end of the day. Now, we can speak about the pace, we can speak about where it's going to start and succeed, or how we can learn from early failures potentially, but we can see at least 3 areas where it's really going to change the way enterprises are going to function in the future. The first one is the one where people are a lot focused today, is around customers. It's around, we can see things happening in branding, we can see some sales started to happen, we can see that there is a big potential, of course. But to me, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot more to come in the enterprise world. First of all, in terms of production, think about digital twins, for instance, think about lots of things which are in the physical world today, which can be mirrored in the digital world and through the metaverse combined and connected. And that's the potential that metaverse can bring there. And we are convinced that in terms of production, it's going to potentially bring lots of value to companies. And the third dimension is around everything which is connected to employees, actually. At Accenture, we have already in the US distributed through during the COVID time 60,000 headsets, Oculus headsets, to enable a better integration experience of our new employees. Of course, our offices were not open across the US during the COVID time. And we have been recruiting lots of people. We could not welcome them in our offices to offer them an experience of getting connected to their colleagues through the metaverse has been one way of developing this experience of belonging to a team, belonging to a company, and then contributing to it. So that's just one aspect of it, but you can think about training. You were mentioning education. In the enterprise world, it's about training. We are convinced that lots of the training is going to happen in the metaverse in the future. We, maybe on your end, you have started to use it. On our end, we've started our training. We are learning from what works, what doesn't work, but we are starting our trainings in the metaverse as we speak.
So it's interesting thinking about these three kind of broad ways or areas, right? You talk about customers, production, and employees. I think maybe in line with this, I mean, the customer piece feels intuitive, right? I think people have a sense of what this might look like to some extent. And I think the employees thing almost feels like an extension of that. To me, the production one is the most, maybe the least obvious of the three. You mentioned digital twins. Like, can you give us a hypothetical use case or something like that for the way work might get done in the future, if down one potential path for how this might look? They get a sense of how is the metaverse, how might the metaverse affect the production, the actual process of creation and production and business activity.
Yeah, no, I can give you, without going into specific names, the examples on which we are working right now. Think about factories of sweets, for instance. And if you end up at the end of the production line, you may end up with some defects. You may end up with some boxes where you don't have the right components. And the point of having these digital twins in the metaverse is that if you build that in a way which is reproducing what is happening in the real world, so to speak, you will be able to identify a lot faster where the issue happen on the value chain and how to repair it. And that element of identification of the issue, then repairing it faster, of course, is enabling more productivity for the whole factory and therefore for the company. And that's just one example of the type of use cases on which we work today.
I think it's fascinating thinking about, this idea of a digital twin and the way, for all of us who've grown up in some sort of a video game basic culture where the idea of, sliding around a room to investigate different things that are in a space, you can do that very quickly. But if you imagine trying to do that in real life, it would take a lot of time to crawl over machinery and look under this and look at that. And this idea that you could do that, to me, that's a very interesting and intuitive way to think about one of the benefits of being able to make that happen. I'd have to think that there's got to be a lot of other technologies that would have to play a role in some sort of a process like that. I mean, in the sense of, how I understand that the metaverse would be a way that you interact with that digital twin to try and understand it. But how does the digital twin get created? That's still not a trivial process, I would think. And I'd have to think there's other technologies that would have to feed into that potentially, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the way you think about it, because that's the way we look at it, is that it's not one metaverse with one technology. It's a combination of various technologies which brought together can enable to create more value. And there is not one single metaverse today, one single solution. It's really around this combination that things are going to happen in the future.
So if you are if you were going to start, and maybe if I can push you a little bit on this, if we imagine that the metaverse, and obviously if you talk about employees, I think we could imagine that this may affect all companies relatively similarly at the same time, right? Training, onboarding, like things like that. Obviously, companies that are engaging in more virtual work may take more advantage of it than ones that wouldn't. But I'd have to think that things like the customers and production elements of this are going to affect some industries and some types of firms far faster than other ones. who's at that front edge? Who should be nervous if they're in that 80% that you talked about and not in the 15% at this point in time? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, because that's part of the work we do. Is, we always trying to map on the S curve. First of all, how steep is the S curve, right? And second, what is the path of different industries, and which industries are in front of others? And I think what we have found so far, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, is that generally we think about, it's going to be the tech industry first, because it's all digital anyway, and you've got lots of early adopters of new technologies, so that's part somehow of the usual business process. And what we have found so far in terms of our research, in terms of our relation with our clients, is that actually you've got a fair amount of other industries which are now experimenting. Now, let's be precise. Experimenting doesn't mean to scale up, right? It's experimenting. But if you think about the retail industry, if you think about the consumer goods industries, you've seen plenty of examples in the news of these large players getting involved in creating a shop, in building some real estate, in selling some products, and even more interesting than selling the digital products is offering a combination where when you buy the physical product, you've got a digital product as well, and they both combine. And typically it happens now with some car manufacturers where you can buy your physical car, if you like, and you've got your digital car in the metaverse at the same time. And to me, it's an interesting example, because you would not necessarily think about the car manufacturing industry as being a front runner in the metaverse, but actually some are already there and already investing there. So when you look at all these industries, consumer goods, retail, automotive, you can look at all these consumer-oriented industries on top of the technology industry, and then you've got the group of manufacturing industries where, as I was mentioning earlier on, with the digital twins and some of these aspects, we can see some experiments going on as well. So if you look at the broad picture, I would say that the B2C, the consumer goods, consumer industries, definitely yes, and maybe a little bit more counterintuitive, but in the enterprise world, in the manufacturing world, lots is happening as well. So in other terms, no industry is immune, JP.
So if I can maybe, and this kind of looking at one of the questions that came in from Stephanie in the chat, and just a very quick reminder to everyone: feel free to put questions you have in the Q&A in there. We'll try and look at them. I can almost, or maybe I can try to visualize a way in which the idea of a digital twin, right, a digital version of some sort of physical process or activity, feels like it could play a role in some sort of like distance healthcare practice or something like that. Is that something that is that a connection that feels real there, or are you thinking that healthcare may be, it's a lot harder to attach sensors to a person the way you can attach it to a machine, so it would be hard to create that digital twin. I don't know, is healthcare somewhere on that spectrum, or is that a very different kind of a use case for something like that in your mind?
I love your question, because if always when we look at these new technologies, we try to look back at different technology waves and what was happening at the time, at maybe a lesson for this wave. And when we look at digital and some of the previous waves, systematically we find two laggard industries. First one is health. Second one is education. No offense, JP, but it's because of the complexity of it. Of course, education is a complexity of teachings, complexity of the organization as well. So the evolution is most often step by step and really revolutionary. And second, health, because of the complexity of the organization as well, and because you are speaking about the life of people, right? And so it's you can mess up things in consumer goods to some extent. You've got to take over security when you deal with health. And what we have seen throughout COVID is that these two industries which tended to be laggards in previous waves, with the acceleration of digitalization since the start of COVID, there's been lots of catch-up actually. And education, you can speak more about it than I can, but I've seen some things happening which we thought were not possible. They've actually been happening in education online. And similarly with health, there have been lots of examples where there was some regulation which were preventing something to happen online, which have been happening online. So long story short, there is lots of potential here, and we are confident that things will happen. But again, we have to be extremely careful in terms of regulation and in terms of the responsible approach in this industry. And that's making health a particularly complex industry to address.
Okay. I'm sitting here looking at some of these questions, debating whether to spend the entire time we have here talking about the metaverse or not. But maybe at least a little bit, I'd like to kind of shift. Though obviously, as we were kind of getting at, all of these technologies are intertwined to some extent. Kind of thinking about that intertwining, I feel like for a long time, there's been a discussion of automation as kind of one set of processes. And then just lots of talk about big data and analytics for a while. And those have been kind of separate. But as we move into an AI world, whatever one's definition exactly is of AI, those two things start to become more and more intertwined. What if you gave us a thumbnail on the metaverse side of things? Talk a little bit about kind of AI and the way in which you could imagine this reshaping businesses in the types of businesses in coming years.
Yeah. No, AI is a very interesting one, very complex one, of course, depending on what part of the value chain you want to address. We've done a research on the way that companies were absorbing AI in 2019, so just prior to COVID, and we are completing one just now that we're going to publish in a few weeks. So just to see how it has evolved in between 2019 and now, and where our predictions right at the time and what's happening now. And by and large, what was happening at the time in 2019 is that we had lots of promising pilots around the world in lots of industries, in lots of large companies. The big issue was around scaling up. There was lack of examples around scaling up AI, speaking about big data, as you were mentioning, but in terms of really combining that in business model, in business processes with the right talent and creating value at the level of a company and not the business units or just one subsidiary. That's something which was not happening. Fast forward 3 years, we were cautious because of everything which happened throughout COVID. And actually what we've seen in the early results that we are analyzing now is an acceleration of the absorption of AI by companies. And that's connected to the acceleration of digitalization that we have seen in the past 3 years. So it's been a lot about Zoom, but it's not Zoom only, right? There is a lot more going on in terms of investing in data, investing in the talent that goes with it in order to create some value. And in our analysis, we tend to isolate two groups of companies. One group is that we call the leaders, companies which were already ahead of others. Some in the technology industry, of course, not necessarily all of them, but big technology group were ahead of the pack in 2019. 3 years later, they still invest, they still create some more value. They've got platforms. Most of the time, it's platform business models, and they've got AI at the core of it. Of course, everything is in the cloud. When you got cloud, AI, and platform combined, and these companies are continue to be the leaders and have been growing much faster than the rest of companies. So that you could expect. What was less expected is that we found there is a group of companies that we've been calling the leapfroggers. And these companies were not ahead of the pack 3 years back, but actually throughout all this COVID time, all this last crisis, in terms of reducing their investment or focusing them on small parts of a company, they've been doubling down on technology investment, reducing operating expense, and investing more in developing the capital connected to technology. And what we've seen is that they're reaping the rewards now. And this group of leapfroggers for us is very interesting because it's a kind of a sign of the times that in terms of acceleration, of technology changes. You've got some companies which are actually finding the right way to do it through investment, of course, and putting in place the right key success factors to make it happen. But that change is to us seems very interesting to look at.
Again, selfishly for a second, if I can push on the leapfroggers in this idea, does this kind of, I'll try and put words in your mouth, does this suggest that, is this potentially a suggestion that trying to adopt a technology or get involved in a technology too early could actually be a challenge, in the sense that you kind of maybe you get stuck in version 1 of the technology, but if you come in a little bit later, version 2 is the one you really want to adopt, and the leapfroggers kind of get to come in at the right moment. Am I reading that the right way, or is that a mischaracterization of the comment, or maybe at least a too strong of a statement?
It's a little bit too strong of a statement, in the sense that we used to look at fast following being a recipe for success some years back. We do not believe that fast following is a recipe for success right now, because the changes are going so fast that just wait and see is in our view too dangerous these days.
So bad news for higher education. Okay, fair.
You're the expert, I'm not the expert.
I feel like I can make that crack right. That seems like one I can kind of do there to some extent. So when we think about AI, and we think about kind of the ways in which companies are kind of investing in a set of tools to help them run their business. I think one of the big questions is how much of an AI process or any sort of kind of data-driven processes is meant to kind of augment the decision-making of human beings versus to replace the decision-making of human beings. There's big advantages to replacing, even ignoring kind of costs or things, but like the speed of decision-making and things like that can obviously be dramatically enhanced with automating. But I think there probably are still a lot of people, a lot of managers and leaders concerned about the risks and downsides. Like, how are you seeing people think about the ways that they might plan to try to use the technologies, and are there certain types of companies, back to our kind of different verticals, who maybe are more focused on augmentation versus kind of automation and replacement that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, no, it's very important debate, of course, we've been working ourselves and working in partnerships with some external researchers on that to get both views of a debate as much as possible. Well, what I would say is this: is that all our use cases and the way we work with our clients on automation, and we work a lot on automation cases with our clients. Speaking of the Chief Strategy Officer of Accenture earlier, Bhaskar Ghosh, he just published a book called The Automation Advantage. So it's the message is clear: is that throughout the cases that we work on with our clients, we believe that intelligent automation, when it is thought and implemented in a way which is creating value, is creating business advantage and competitive advantage for companies, and we've got that across all the industries with which we work, and we work with 19 industries around the world. Now, if we look about your question around productivity and jobs, so as we had these questions, we wanted to look at micro data, because there is a whole macro debate, of course, but the point is, for us, as we work in a company, we look at micro data. So we work at company level with company data, and we decided to do a deep dive on our own company. And so we've been doing some deep dives with some of my colleagues, with our lead economist, around when we look at an automation process that we implement for a client. It's part of his outsourcing deals where we take the employees of clients, right, and we run the operation for the clients. And we look at that, and we've been automating some processes for a large client. And we look at the way that the automation has changed the number of jobs and has changed things around in terms of qualification, in terms of skills of the unit for which we were working. And what is interesting here is that you can have all the best business cases of the world. You've got to look at a longitudinal study, right? You need to look at what is happening at year 1, and then you look at year 2, year 3 to see how it is implementing and what are the consequences. And long story short, I can share you all the details that you and colleagues here are interested in to stress test, and we can open them. Long story short, there is a rise of productivity. There is not necessarily a decrease of jobs, because by rising the productivity, the company is gaining competitive advantage, and then it's growing its revenue. So it's more a kind of positive story than just cutting costs and that's it. I think that's we need to look at the big picture across several years. And when we look at the big picture across several years, and we try to isolate the specific effects of putting AI and automation at the core of these processes, that's a result we found. So we are positive, we are optimistic about that, and we think that by and large, when it's done well, it is not only creating productivity, but creating value for the company and creating value for the employees as well.
Looking at some of these questions and trying to make sure we tackle some of these. There was a couple of questions that came in on a related theme. When I think about the disruptions of the last 2 years, obviously the first and foremost is the public health kind of issues, healthcare, the need for a vaccine and treatments and things like that. I think one other very common thing we saw a lot of on Twitter and elsewhere out there was big questions and complaints about supply chain. It's taking me months to get this, or we can't build those, or car prices are through the roof because we can't get enough chips and things like that. Supply chain is obviously a big issue, and it's one of those ones we probably don't pay a ton of attention to. Most people don't pay attention to until there's a problem with it to some extent. But I feel like the last couple of years has really raised the elevation of this. Are there technologies that you see that will affect kind of the global logistics and supply chain industry in important ways in coming years, either to help address or avert kind of the impact of future crises, or to kind of augment the way in which supply chains kind of play out? Are there cool topics there that we should be paying attention to and thinking about?
Cool topics, I do not know, but it's definitely a hot topic. That's for sure. I agree with you, and for all the reasons that we can see in the news, of course, and some of them are pretty daunting. It means that lots of companies have got to look at their supply chain, and that supply chain is becoming a strategic topic again. Where it's in this case, I would say it's not only a question of technology. Of course, technology can help, but it's a lot around the strategy put in place by the companies, the way they develop the resilience of their operation. And there is lots of other factors which at this point in time have got a more predominant impact than technologies themselves.
Okay. Another question that came in that I actually that came out of I think a relatively quick comment that you made earlier that Susan Perkins brought up that I want to come back to here. You talked about inclusion and diversity as kind of having impacts and relevance for these discussions around technology to some extent. Can you say more there? Because that felt like a relatively brief but a pretty provocative kind of statement to be thinking about. I don't think a lot of us kind of would make that leap necessarily to thinking about how some of this work that you're doing directly relates to discussions of inclusion and diversity. But it's clear that this is a topic that you've thought about and that's relevant for you and Accenture Research.
Yeah, no, it's let me pick up just two examples. First one is in terms of the research that we produced. We produced a research last fall with a professor at another university, in this case, about what we call hidden workers. And hidden workers is in the US, but not only in the US, we look at some European markets as well. It's a lot around the workers who are excluded from the labor market right now. And when you put, and lots of companies put AI at the core of their recruitment processes, because it's a way to go very fast in terms of selecting the potential right candidates based on certain criteria, you've got a group, or to be more precise, an addition of multiple groups which get excluded. Think about women who may have stopped their career for a while because they had to care about their family, and not only their children, can be parents now, of course. And then, there is something not smooth in the career, rejected. Think about someone who's had an issue and is leaving jail. That's a stigma, rejected. Think about someone who's got, did not graduate from Stern School of Business of one of these fabulous universities, rejected, and so on and so forth. And what we found by looking really at granular level is that you've got millions of workers that companies need and that they cannot find right now in the labor market because of the processes they put in place. So we've got this mismatch between the need of companies to recruit more, and we know that in the US there is a big mismatch right now in terms of having more than 10 million job opens and companies not finding the right people, and people just being excluded. And you've got AI. I mean, AI does not explain all of it, but actually the recruiting processes with AI at the core explain some parts of it. And we've been happy to see that lots of organizations that we've been speaking with have been listening to that and are addressing that right now. And some of my colleagues actually been speaking to the US Congress as well recently, because US Congress decided to look at that as a serious matter. So to me, that's one example of research done on AI, looking at this question of inclusion and diversity, and hopefully having an impact on our community ultimately. Now, that's the first example. The second example is just within the work we do. I was mentioning the research protocols we put in place. For years, the type of research that we're doing on everything and anything did not take into account the diversity of consumers in the US, according to certain criteria. Ethnicity was not a criteria for many years. Now we have decided that systematically it becomes a criteria, and that means we've got the proper sample. That means we look at what are the specificities that have to be taken into account if you want to produce some research which at the end of the day is relevant, not only for the majority group, but as well for groups which have been not researched so much in details for many years.
I think that's it's great to hear that you're thinking in those ways, and I think it is that challenge, right? We often look at kind of the aggregate data, and we look at the average, or we look at something like that, and because it's easy, but it's hard. But it's easy then to miss so much of the range and the diversity that we're talking about for all of these things, heterogeneity in preferences, backgrounds, opportunities, things like that. So. Kind of on that theme, you were kind of mentioning in on some of this, and I apologize for bringing Metaverse back in a little bit. But we often, from a regulatory perspective, we often make comments, and it's easier for people like me to say it as opposed to someone like Rob, who's actually been in a regulatory related role to some extent. That industry is always one or two steps ahead of the regulators in terms of thinking about the implications of these things. And that puts regulators in a difficult situation. As we think about the metaverse specifically, is there anything that makes you nervous in a way that if you had the direct pipeline to be speaking to regulators in the US or the EU or elsewhere, what should they be paying attention to now before it's too late? Or before something bad happens? Is there anything that you're aware of or thinking about or worried about from that perspective?
No, it's a great discussion, and as we do some research, part of it in North America, part of it in Europe, we can see that even the mindset of people is different. And in some people who work with in North America being more concerned about letting innovators innovate and regulate when you can really harvest what's going right, what's going wrong, and then you can regulate. whether in Europe we're dealing a lot with people who think that it's important to regulate first, right, and avoid other things to happen. So we are moving in between these two poles, I would say, and speaking with both. And so our point is always that we innovate in the context where we operate. And what is in the US context is with the US regulation. What is in Europe is with the European regulation. I would say at this point in time, the focus for us is to make sure that some of the daunting aspects of what is happening on the internet is not happening in the metaverse, and that whether it's the regulator, whether it's companies together, find ways to make it safe, secure for people who are going to join the internet, because it's going to be critical to make it a long lasting success.
And then I feel like, given that we are in an educational environment, and I've, at least looking a little bit at who's here today, I feel like I kind of need to end with, or maybe end with a question around what's relevant for students, right? So, and in a business school, professional environment, what most people care about is jobs, right? So if you're thinking about advice to students today, what are the things that they should be investing time and energy to learn more about? What are the types of skills that they should be trying to develop that will be important for their careers 3, 5, 10 years down the road? And maybe if I can sneak in a bit of a side question, what does it take to get a job in Accenture research, right? What are the kind of skills that you're looking for there? But just kind of, again, thinking through the advice that you might offer career-wise to a bunch of students, undergrad, MBA, but kind of, starting or restarting their careers, kind of coming out of a place like this.
Yeah, well, to me, the first point, which may seem a paradox, because of everything we're living through this week, is that there's never been such a good time to be a student, because just the possibilities in terms of jobs that students going through your school in particular, but New York University in general, just the opportunities are enormous, and they never been so good. When you look back 10 years, 20 years, never been so good, never been so open. When we look, I'm sure lots of your students end up working for startups. We just finished a study on unicorns in Europe, and we can see the number of students going to startups now is pretty amazing, and it's a great way to have a first experience, of course, and often a very valuable one. So I would say, to me, it's all about passion, and my only point when students ask me, and I'm teaching in some instances, and when students ask me about what they should do, is not to give them, you should do this and that, but follow your passion. First of all, to me, that's a thing which matters, because they've got plenty of opportunities. The other thing I would say, just reflecting on what we've been going through in the past 3 years, and what I see around me, is just be careful about two things that we're not so careful about in the past. At least my generation, maybe not yours, but mine. It's the first thing is mental health. I've seen so many cases of people not taking care of it, mental health, and then facing issues, which are really moving at the end of the day. So we always speak at school about hard skills. To me right now, the way for every one of us to look at our mental health, to take care of that, is absolutely critical for the future, because we live in a world with many things happening, and that is in my view absolutely critical right now to look at, and then I think it's a matter of trying, as you were mentioning Accenture, you were kind enough to mention Accenture and Accenture Research. We are recruiting at Accenture something like 100,000 people a year. So it's big number of recruitments in different roles and different functions. At Accenture Research is a lot smaller, of course. But the point is that, reflecting to what I was mentioning earlier, is that we try to be less focused on actually the actual degree, even if degree and education matters, of course, but we try to look at personalities, people, and the way they are curious about things. And in research, it's a lot about curiosity. The other things we can teach them, people can learn them. That type of things is a lot more difficult, especially now that the big thing in front of us is how to be creative online. I've proven throughout the last 3 years that we can be all extremely productive online. Now the question is, can we be as well as creative as we are productive? And that, going back to the metaverse, of course, but not only. Zoom, of course, but not only. It's a lot around that. And I think that for those of the students who are going to crack that and manage to get creative online with others in a collaborative manner, there are going to be lots of opportunities ahead.
So what you're saying is, to be successful, people need to understand how the technology works. They need to understand human social interaction. They need to understand the regulatory environment. So a little bit of everything is that. Sorry, not to put too much, but and this is important, right? This is about this interaction of it. This is not about technology only. It's not about people only. It's about the interactions between the people and the technology, and that's what makes a lot of these things so complicated, in my perspective.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing? It's a long list, I know. One more thing, because I was speaking with students at a business school last week, and the one thing I told them in terms of question to ask to their future recruiters is, what are they measuring in terms of their progress towards being net zero in terms of carbon footprint, and how is that in their business model? Not some type of loose, glossy corporate citizenship report, at the core of their business model. Because if you think 10 years down the line, I do not know what businesses will be 10 years down the line. What I sense is that sustainability topic is only going to grow. And if we want to leave something here in our jobs, it's a lot about the way we contribute to the future, right? And the way to contribute to the future, to me now, it's a lot around sustainability. So net zero is a way to just crystallize it in one indicator. But to me, it's a lot about that these days. And I can see that lots of students are very passionate about that, and of course, for the right reasons. And they should not be shy to ask this question to their future employers and how they put that at the core of their business model.
I'm sure many students are happy to hear that. I'm sure many recruiters are a little less happy to hear that request, that they should ask that question. But I think you're right. It's the kind of question students who care about this should feel empowered to ask those types of questions. We are out of time. This has been a true pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and share with us. And really, personally, I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you. And I think I'm handing it back over to Rob now to wrap us up. But thank you again, Francis, so much.
Likewise, thank
you. JP and Francis, thank you both so much. That was truly a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed it. And Francis, I really appreciate that you ended on that note of looking to the future, right? Because of course, this is the Center for the Future of Management. So we are very intentionally trying to be sort of setting our eyes, 5, 10, 15 or more years into the future, and sort of understanding the trends that are going to get us from right now to that point. So thank you again, Francis and JP. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate the audience participation. One quick note. So I just want to highlight that the next event in our speaker series is on April 7th at noon. That's New York time, when we're going to welcome 3 distinguished speakers, MIT's Daron Acemoglu, McKinsey's Jacques Bouyguin, and Harvard Business School's Rafaela Sadoun. They're going to be discussing the organizational economics of AI. For more information and to sign up, please visit our website, stern.nyu.edu/events. www.accenture.com/CFM. That's it for today. Thank you very much, and goodbye to everybody. Thank you again, Francis. Thank you, JP.